All right. Good morning, Doug. I can tell by the painting behind you that you are in your home in Buenos Aires. So welcome to the Southern Cone.
Well, it's good to be here, although I've got to say, more than ever, I hate the mob scenes that airports have come to represent. They're like bus stations used to be, but without the adventure that stations used to be able to supply. It's terrible. They're crowds and they're degrading, having to go through the TSA drill, and I just hate it, frankly. And the quality of the flights, although I've got to say, American Airlines from DFW down to Buenos Aires, the flight itself wasn't bad, but generally speaking, the whole experience of flying has been degraded over the years, I think. But maybe I'm just jaded because I've got, I don't know how many millions of air miles at this point. So,
well, it definitely becomes a drag over time, but I think that the experience since, in the last, just since COVID has gotten dramatically worse. Whereas, the flight crew, which are not, you can't call them stewardesses, then it changed to flight attendants. Now they're members of the flight crew that have other titles, and instead of being customer service oriented by default, they are enforcers of policy by default. So that basic switch up, regardless of everything else, changes the dynamics for the worse.
It's happened throughout society where your good-looking, friendly airline stewardess has been transformed into Ilsa, she-wolf of the SS, who we've discussed before in the past.
Exactly.
A real person, incidentally.
Yeah. Okay. So you're in Buenos Aires. You have some meetings in the next coming days with locals, and you'll be able to give us a sense of boots on the ground in the next time we talk, probably.
Yeah, I think so. I'm going to a group I belong to. It's a 100-year-old group that has 8 Brits, 8 Americans, and 8 Argentines. And everybody, one person every month gives a paper on something that he knows about. And the others listen, and then we have a dinner, and it's very gemütlich. So I'm kind of exclusive. And then tomorrow, I'm going to go to another group, which coincidentally is also about 100 years old, where it's just for Americans living in Buenos Aires who get together and have lunch and discuss current affairs. And we have all kinds. We've got left-wing types, right-wing types. And there's a few libertarian Americans have come down to Buenos Aires. I've been able to inject them into the group too. So anyway, I guess I'll do that tomorrow.
Good. Well, we'll get an update on what the real vibe is. From what I've heard from people there, there's some optimism about Milei, among even people that didn't necessarily support him.
Well, I think so. I talked to my driver that took me in from Ezeiza to downtown BA, where I am now. And as we talked, it turned out that he was on the borderline, but yeah, he was favorable towards Milei. Change is traumatic, even if it's change from living in a fire. You can still be afraid of jumping into the frying pan, put it that way. And then I was talking with my maid, and her Spanish sped up a lot, and I lost her. But it had something to do with the war that she didn't like about Milei. And I go, he doesn't like, he's not in a position to start a war. Argentina doesn't have an army, it doesn't have a navy. That was the good thing about the Falklands War. They pretty much dropped all that stuff by the wayside. So I'm going to have to find out more about her misgivings about Milei, something to do with the war. Maybe it's because he's very pro-Israel and she's afraid that they're going to draft Argentines to go over and stick their heads in the meat grinder. I don't know.
Yeah, it's hard to imagine. Hard to imagine if you do that. Okay.
Anyway, these are just initial random impressions that are apropos of really nothing.
Okay. All right. So what's today, according to the Encyclopedia Britannica? Anything useful we can pull from that?
Well, December 6th, what went on historically today? interesting to observe that today is Stalin's birthday. He was born in 1878, so it's nothing to celebrate. I think it would have been better if they celebrated or acknowledged his death day, which came in 1953 and was rather kind of disgusting. Anyway, this is very interesting. It's that, you have this world-class psychopathic criminal, and everybody was afraid of him. Even Beria, the head of his secret police, who was a totally ruthless cutthroat in charge of the KGB when it was a very unmellow organization. Not that it's mellow today, but you ask yourself, why did nobody kill him? Frankly, I mean, because they were all the people around him were being bumped off slowly, one by one, and then their very existence excised from the history books, and they were cut out of pictures where they were with Stalin and so forth. So you ask yourself, why did nobody kill Stalin? I mean, it's, well, fear, I guess. So anyway, it's a good question. Horrible dictator that nobody loved. I mean, some people actually loved Hitler and bought all the stuff that he was selling. But, one of the big differences between Nazi Germany and Stalinist Soviet Union was that foreign diplomats were edgy and a little bit afraid about going to Russia in those days. They thought maybe it'd be a one-way trip, but nobody was really afraid. With the Germans, they were kind of civilized, notwithstanding the many problems they obviously had. But why didn't anybody kill Stalin? Everybody talks about why didn't somebody kill Hitler as a baby? And would you be justified in killing Hitler as a baby before? Yes, I know, these high school kid arguments. But why didn't anybody, in fact, kill Stalin? Because they all realized that their lives were in danger.
Well, there were attempts on Hitler, at least, right?
Yes, there were several attempts, in addition to Operation Valkyrie there at the end, where the bomb went off in East Prussia during the war. Yeah, there were previous attempts, but
there weren't any known attempts on Stalin at all.
Yes, yeah. There is an interesting attempt on the part of Joseph Tito, who was the dictator of Yugoslavia in those days. And Tito, who was, wanted to go his own way and didn't want to be a Soviet satellite. And Stalin didn't like that. So, he tried to assassinate him a number of times, and Tito figured out that it was Stalin trying to kill him. So he got a message to Stalin, and I forget the nature of it. I researched this once in the past because it was so interesting. But anyway, he got a note to Stalin, and it was basically, stop sending people to try to kill me, or I'll send somebody to kill you, and he'll succeed. And apparently that worked.
Wow. Was Tito the guy who built all of those bunkers in Albania, or was that someone else?
No, that was somebody different. That was somebody, on a scale of awfulness, with Stalin up there at around 10, with Pol Pot and other Mao and for that matter, Hitler, although Hitler ruled out the Jews and that, otherwise he wasn't as awful as the other people, I don't think. But you can't say that.
You can't.
You're not allowed to say that. Who was that absolutely horrible person that ruled Albania from World War into World War II to, I think around 1990 something, when the place was overturned and filled the place with bunkers. What the hell was his name?
Enver Hoxha?
Enver Hoxha, yes. And it was the most isolated country in the world. It was on a level with North Korea. So, yeah, you get all these horrible people.
the bunker thing when we visited there really stood out. It was amazing. These things were everywhere. It was, I mean, I don't know how many tons of concrete must have been poured for those many thousands of bunkers that seem like they're in the middle of nowhere, but everywhere.
Yeah, and I'm wondering, what are they going to do with all those bunkers? It's going to be expensive to dig up all that concrete. Or will they just stay there forever? Because it's,
I think maybe when there's next comet that strikes Earth and civilization maybe reemerges again, there'll be like layers. There'll be archaeologists will be digging through and finding a series of bunkers, wondering how
and
these
maybe
things.
Albanians will be among the relatively few people that survive because of the foresight of Comrade Hoxha.
That's a good point. That's a good
Yeah,
point.
you
What
know,
made him so? What, he was as bad, you say, as Stalin? I mean, he was like really oppressive.
he was like on a level with the Kims in North
Okay.
Korea. You know, made it a completely isolated police state
Mm,
where no information went in and no information went out. That type of thing.
that's amazing. Yeah,
Yeah.
this says there's a an average of 5.7 bunkers for every square kilometer.
Wow, that's a lot. Wow. That's, I don't know how many people there are per square kilometer in Albania, but you could put more than one person in a bunker. So everybody would have his bunker, I guess.
That's shocking.
Yeah, it is shocking. I mean, the stupidity of these people. But you don't get the best and brightest going into government. You get the
This,
most psychopathic and the worst. And perfect illustration, I think.
yeah,
Anyway,
this is self-evidently true if you look around the world, I think.
but good riddance on Stalin, who died, let's see, it was March of 1953. So, you know, next March, we'll check and see if his death is commemorated the way his birthday is. And the other guy, another guy, I should say, that died today, and I wrote this down. I'm having trouble reading my own writing, in addition to the fact it's a very unusual name. There's a guy named Shinra Ambedkar, who is an Indian. He died in 1956. Nobody's ever heard of him, of course. I'd never heard of him. It's that he was an early leader of the Dalit movement in India. And Dalit is a new word, a polite word for untouchable. So there are tens of millions of so-called untouchables in India. Their caste system. These are people that you used to not even be able to touch because they were so on the bottom of society. And he changed the name from calling them untouchables in English to calling them Dalits, because I guess they still exist. But the caste system, I guess, is breaking up in India today, slowly. Although I can't say that from firsthand observation. And it's hard to see how anything will change radically in a place like India anyway.
Well, I follow Giant Bandari's Twitter, and he certainly doesn't make it look like they're moving toward greater civilization. Let's put it that way.
Yeah, people should actually read Giant's stuff. And when he gives a speech about how backward India is, it's actually very funny. So,
It's hilarious.
so
He's not intending to be funny, though. I don't think when he's saying it, he's just so ruthless.
yeah, that's right. That's right. Well, the truth is often funny. I mean, the best comedians, of course, are the ones that are telling the truth, like court jesters in medieval times. And I was on a Zoom call, I guess it was yesterday, with a bunch of fund managers. And towards the end of the conversation, we were talking about Islam became a subject. And all these guys are pretty familiar with the tenets of it. A lot of the guys are ex-military guys that are fund managers. It's an interesting group, generally speaking. And one of them pointed out that soon the largest Muslim country in the world will not be Indonesia or Pakistan I guess those are the two contenders today for largest Muslim country, it will be India. And this is kind of interesting because after World War II, the British divided India into India and Pakistan according to religious grounds. But now, with a giant number of Muslims in India along the Pakistani border primarily, it's probably a time bomb waiting to go off because the Hindus are becoming, very nationalistic about being Hindus. And of course, the Muslims react to that. So civil war coming in India, or another secession, who knows, but probably, I think, in the cards.
It probably would make natural sense for them to secede, right? If they have fundamentally different cultures, different people. I don't really love the idea of the European powers carving up a map the way they've done, sort of generally, because a lot of times they did it seems that without regard to the natural division of peoples. But it seems like what they did between Pakistan and India made basic sense, right?
Yeah, it does make basic sense. Of course, you got to look at the bright side and the dark side. Now, the Pakistanis have nuclear weapons, and at some point, it's not out of the question that the Indians or the Hindus and the Muslims will use them against each other because they hate each other. They really do hate each other. So, and that kind of leads to the question of colonialism and anti-colonialism and neo-colonialism. These are all words that have become current. It's one more thing that's bubbled up from the cesspool of wokeness today. And I've got to say, I'm not a fan of colonialism, because if I lived in a country and foreigners came and invaded, had superior technology, and then ruled over us, and who'd like that? On the other hand, it was a mistake that the West made, probably colonizing everywhere. But these people really ought to be thankful for it, because they'd still be, eating worms and grubbing for roots and berries if the West had not imposed itself on them. But on the other hand, if I was a local, I certainly wouldn't want foreigners coming in and telling me what to do, even if they brought magic juju with them, which they did.
Exactly. Well, I'm reading for homeschool for my daughter. We're reading the Uncle Eric books, Rick Mayberry's books on, World War I and World War II, and we're basically almost done with the World War I one now. And he talks about basically the 10 causes of war, and one of them was, he called it Anglo-Saxonism, and he also called it / white man's burden. That idea, that they had some duty to civilize the peoples of the world, and how that got, the Western world into all kinds of quagmires, and, that didn't work out for the most part.
No, it didn't. It goes back to that old saying, no good deed goes unpunished. Not that it was necessarily a good deed, but, like blacks in the US, many of them whine and complain about being here in the US, but frankly, they won the jackpot when their ancestors were stolen from Africa and enslaved, because if they were still in Africa, they'd have nothing. They'd be, the life of the average African is not too good. The life of even a black living in the ghetto is much, much, much better than almost any African today. So,
well, we can see it in the migration results we see right now with Africans moving in mass to Europe, and apparently through the southern border in the US as well.
Yes, and there are approximately 0 American blacks that actually go back to Africa. So, the reality speaks for itself. as it were. And of course, we can talk about Africa another time. I'm of the opinion that at some point, because as the West financially degrades and explodes, which is going to happen, foreign aid to Africa is going to stop. And the population boom in Africa will also stop and go into reverse, because Africa is it's a welfare recipient at this point. I mean, I've said before that the Africans should be eternally grateful to the Europeans if, when Da Gama was rounding the Cape of Good Hope, he thrown out a wheel because they didn't have a wheel. But that wouldn't have done any good, because he would have had to have thrown out an instruction book too. But they couldn't read. So, it was a mixed bag, the Europeans conquering Africa. Can't wait to see how it works out, but we won't know for 100 years.
No, before we move off the Indian topic, I think it's something in the news that relates to that is that last week a Paraguayan official resigned after signing an agreement with a fictional country, and this country was essentially made up by this Indian guru who apparently is on the run from the Indian government. And he created a country. What is the name of that country? Some fictional country that's allegedly off the coast of Ecuador, but he calls it a cosmic nation. So allegedly it's an island, but I'm not sure if it's actually anything other than something conjured in his mind. Anyway, this official signed, in the agriculture department, signed an agreement with this fictitious country. It was found out that it was a fictitious country, and he had to resign in shame. What do you think of that whole situation?
Well, I mean, what do you expect? This shows that most people have absolutely no knowledge of geography. And of course, Paraguay is going to be worse than most, because it's the most isolated, always has been, and still is, although not nearly as bad as it used to be, the most isolated and backward country in South America. So that's but you've got to hand it to somebody like this Indian. I'm sure he's whacked out and loony, but the boldness of stepping into a country and introducing yourself as the president or prime minister of some fictional country, and to think that these high Paraguayan government officials didn't even, first is Google him and find out if the country exists. But I'm all for fictional and newly founded countries. I'm all for it. I mean, you had Sealand, founded by Prince Roy Bates, who I spent the day with in England, and it still kind of exists. It's a radar tower in the English Channel. And Liberland, which is turning into maybe a real country in an island in the Danube River between Serbia and Croatia. So I'm all for this type of thing. Like Mao said, as long as we're talking about dictators, let 1,000 flowers bloom. Yeah, so I think it's fun. It's great free entertainment at worst.
Cosmic country, though, it's fantastic. So allegedly, they say it will reportedly be established on a private island off the coast of Ecuador, purchased by some of his wealthy devotees. He said applications are open for those who want to apply for citizenship and a passport, which allows for free entry in all 11 dimensions and 14 locus.
That sounds better than 192 countries.
Yeah,
all for it. Yeah, and so maybe I'll get one of those passports. Keep it in mind.
Well, you have to be Hindu. You have to be Hindu to apply.
Oh, that's too bad. Oh well. Maybe somebody will found a different kind of country like that I can join. But yeah, well, may Brahma bless him. I guess it's Brahma, or is it? Maybe it's Shiva, or who's the third big god? Brahma, Shiva, and Kali. Is it Kali?
Oh, Kali.
Maybe it is. Yeah.
What's the elephant one?
Oh, that's Ganesh.
Ganesh. Yeah, yeah.
Yes. Yeah.
Hard to keep track.
It really is. Well, it's impossible, probably. I think they've got many hundreds of gods.
Yeah. Well, good luck to him.
Yeah, but I think that's an interesting tidbit, and maybe we'll hear further reports on his progress. And I wish him well, and hope that his passport is widely accepted someday. I mean, listen, it wasn't so long ago. Well, kind of is long ago now, but I used to travel on my World Service Authority passport, which was about as valid, frankly, as the whatever guy's passport is. And I gained entrance and exit from, let me see, Honduras, Costa Rica, Peru, French Polynesia, and I'm missing some other place. Did I use it in Iceland? I'll have to check the passport and see if they stamped it. And I was turned away, rather unpleasantly in Switzerland. They sent me to the back of the line, and Rhodesia at the time. They sent me to the back of the line like a bad little boy, go to the end of the line.
Good, sir.
Right. And in Egypt, with my World Service Authority passport, I would have been accepted, except for the fact that somebody was using one and assassinated their ambassador to someplace the week before. And of course, they're all on red alert. Watch for people that are trying to enter with this. And this was a time that I was really feeling my oats, and being taken into a back office in Egypt.
It's risky, Doug.
It is risky, I would say. But it wasn't Egypt. Wait a minute. It was Morocco. That's where it was. It wasn't in Egypt. I've got to check the stamps on my passport, because you've been to all these places so many times. What happened? Was it this country or that country? Anyway, it was another Arab country, and it was Morocco. And the reason I remember it was Morocco, and it was the same drill. And I do remember this in particular because I had to speak French with the guy. And, my French was pretty passable then, semi-passable now. And so I did what you always do when you confront a government official. He said, this passport, this is all in French. He says, this passport's no good here. And I looked at him and I said, well, what am I supposed to do? He's got to solve the problem for me.
Exactly.
And it was wonderful because you could tell the French were there because he gave a perfect Gallic shrug. So took out my American passport and went back to the line and so forth. But anyway, God bless whatever that guy's name that fooled the Paraguayans.
Yeah, good for him.
And the last thing that I got that happened today was this is the day that Jefferson Davis died in 1889. And I don't think this will get us banned from YouTube, saying that I'm not going to say that I'm a fan of Jefferson Davis, but I think it's very, very sad, very, very unfortunate that the story of the war between the states and Jefferson Davis and all this type of thing, it's been mythologized, and we only hear one side of the story. South bad, South evil, North good, Lincoln good. And I don't think Lincoln was good, frankly.
When you set aside it seems like that's a bad start, isn't it?
What is?
When he set aside the Constitution, it seemed like that alone would set a bad precedent for his reputation and name, but it doesn't seem to have stuck with him.
No, people forget about the fact that Lincoln locked up hundreds of newspaper editors and reporters and people that were not actively supporting or non-supporting his invasion of the South. And couple of miscellaneous observations about Jefferson Davis. It's that he was indicted for treason after the war. He wanted to continue the war after Robert E. Lee surrendered at Appomattox, but that was Lee and the major army of the South that surrendered then. But Davis didn't want to surrender. He wanted to go across the Mississippi and still have a Southern country and keep it going. Anyway, he was arrested. He never got that far. He was arrested in someplace in Georgia, I think. And they imprisoned him for 2 years under very harsh, unnecessarily harsh circumstances with leg irons and in a damp dungeon. It was almost like torture. Actually, it was. And he was indicted for treason, but he was never tried for treason, although Jefferson Davis wanted them to try him for treason because he could have presented the case for the fact that the secession was legal under the Constitution. It was legitimate. And but they didn't want it to happen because a lot of people in the aftermath of the war thought, this was pointless slaughter of 700,000 people for nothing, and the South should have been able to go. Of course, the South never really had a prayer. I mean, they won the first battle, the Battle of Bull Run, but Jefferson Davis made a big mistake when the way it worked was that after South Carolina and a few other states seceded, Lincoln mobilized the Northern Army. So put together 100,000 men. It was a very small army before that. And when Virginia and a few other states saw what was going on, this major army being built up by people in the North, they seceded too. That's how it really kind of started. Oh. And then the South wanted all of the U.S. forts in the South. Well, one that was a holdout was on an island, Fort Sumter. And the big mistake that Jefferson Davis made was having attacked Fort Sumter, which was ridiculous because there were only like 30 or 40 Union soldiers on it. And just leave them alone until they go away. I mean, but, you launch cannonballs and then, there's Old Glory up there and all the chimpanzees start hooting and panting. So Fort Sumter and the attack on Fort Sumter, which was, I guess Jefferson Davis thought it was symbolic, get out of our land. Okay, I understand that. But for the South to secede, it was impossible because population-wise, the South with white men, because it was a war fought mainly by white men, they were outnumbered 4-1. So those aren't odds that you like. And they didn't have serious railroads to transport goods. They didn't have any serious foundries. They didn't have any shipbuilding facilities that were serious. They didn't have any, I mean, it was an agricultural society, basically.
Compared to the industrialized North, right?
They didn't have a prayer from every point of view, but they held out for 4 years. So it's too bad. But, I blame this on Lincoln because, and people say, well, he fought to make men free. This is not true at all. I mean, it's well known and documented that Lincoln was not a fan of Black people. And his ideal solution was to ship them back to Africa. And that's what Liberia and Sierra Leone were all about. They were Black colonies from. So anyway, so Lincoln was responsible for this total and unnecessary disaster. You say, well, wait a minute. Aren't we better off that the South stayed part of the U.S.? Well, yeah, in some ways, maybe. But in other ways, maybe it would have been better if the US had remained 13 separate independent colonies. I mean, you can write all kinds of alternate history about this. And then what would have happened to with the conquest of the West and our stealing land from the Indians? This is another neo-colonialist type of thing that you got to get into. Who's right, who's wrong? You know, it's anyway. It wasn't a civil war. It was a war of secession, which was, and it wasn't about slavery. Yes, a lot of people in the South were really pro-slavery, and a lot of people in the North were really anti-slavery. Okay, fine, that's understandable. Philosophical issue, you know, they didn't have a meeting of minds there, generally speaking. But what the Civil War was really about was that the South was basically paying all the dues, because remember, back then, the US government source of income was excise taxes and import duties. That was basically it. And all the import duties were being paid by the South, who were importing industrial things from Europe, which were higher quality and lower cost than the stuff in the North. So I think 3/4 of the income of the US government, I have to check that number if it's true, were being paid courtesy of the South, importing things at high cost. That was one thing. And the other thing is that the South had rough parity in the Congress, the House and the Senate with the North. But as these new states and territories were being incorporated, question is, will they be a free state or a slave state? Well, if they became a so-called free state, then, you know, the South would be overwhelmed politically and so forth. Anyway, this whole slavery thing is basically a tempest in a teapot, because the last major country to have illegalized slavery, which of course should never have existed anyway, but that's another story about slavery, good or bad. I mean, you got to have these discussions. I mean, everybody makes these assumptions. I mean, yeah, I think it's bad, but I think you ought to discuss why is it bad and what's the history of it. Anyway, Brazil in 1888 was the last major country to illegalize slavery. And I got something for you that I'll bet you not one person in 10,000, 100,000 are aware of. The last country on earth to illegalize slavery was Mauritania in 1985. Slavery was illegal in Mauritania. And I happened to have been in Mauritania a few years ago. And yes, it's illegal, but it's pretty obvious that the people that, I mean, the Black people that are in the Arab part of Mauritania, the southern part's mostly Black, but it's an Arab country, basically. I mean, they're basically kind of like, you know, they're slaves, but they're being paid. And, you know, it's in 1985. This is an amazing number. So it would have disappeared in the South because it was uneconomic.
That's one of the things that I think I told you that I'm reading Saifedean's book, Principles of Economics, with my son. And he makes a clear case that, you know, prosperity eliminates, basically through economics, through the development of civilization, slavery doesn't work. And so it naturally is going to go away. Like it's naturally going to disappear because it's disadvantageous to all participants, including the slave owners. Like it becomes a liability, not an asset. And that was happening in the United States, even at that time period, right? It was starting to become more expensive than it was worth, and it would have worked itself out.
Yeah, it would have. And of course, what would have happened to the slaves in the South? Because the North didn't want all these Black people emigrating, and the Southerners, I don't know how it would have worked out, frankly. But well, you know, history's got a logic of its own, or an illogic of its own, whatever happens.
Illogic. Yes, and so much of what we know about history is revisionist history. It's a story that you can tell yourself. I mean, it's nice for Americans to believe, oh, we did something wrong with slavery. It was a mistake. It was a stain on our country. This is the narrative that I remember from middle school. But we righted the wrong, we fixed it, we addressed it, and, you know, we're on the side of the right and of the righteous. I mean, not the right. And it's that narrative arc makes everyone feel good about where they're going.
Yeah, and as a result, we have a new I guess it is an official national holiday on a par with the 4th of July. Juneteenth in 1619, when the first slave was brought over. I mean, these idiots, they don't realize that every single, I think I'm correct in saying this, every single other country in the world has a history of slavery. So why does the US have to be the one that celebrates Juneteenth?
Yeah, and I mean, my relatives came over as indentured servants. I don't know. I mean, that's pretty close, isn't it?
Yeah, pretty close. Yeah, it was just for a period of time.
Temporary, yeah.
Yeah, but I mean, traditionally, starting in the days of the Roman Empire and before, I mean, slaves could buy their own way out of, so it's all crazy. Well, it's one of the disadvantages of living here on the planet of the apes, quite frankly.
But it does make for entertainment. It does make it very entertaining.
Yeah.
Okay.
And we just hope that we can maintain ourselves in a position where, for us, it's kind of free entertainment to some degree.
Just means it needs to be arm's length.
Arm's length entertainment, right? I just don't want to get involved in the problems with all these hooting and panting people.
No, it's not going to work for us if we can avoid it.
Doesn't.
All right. Well, I think we'll wrap it up there today, Doug. Next time we talk, we'll get an update on what you're hearing in Buenos Aires.
Yeah, and hopefully there will be some questions or reactions or arguments or whatever from those who listen to us, and it'll be the subject for more conversation.
Exactly. All right. Thanks very much, everybody. Thanks, Doug. I really appreciate it.
Thanks, Matt.